Hi, welcome to Bible 365 with Kathy Carter. Today is day 88, which means it is March 28th. If you're going by your calendar and you started on January 1st and you stuck with it every single day since then, today is March 28th, and we are doing Joshua, I think it's 18, Joshua 18 through 1948. All these eights today. I don't know if I should play the lottery. So we're in Joshua. This is a very short reading today, so I don't want to get too deep into the weeds. However, we are in Joshua. Joshua is the person who has brought them through war. He has brought them into the land of Canaan, the Israelites. The Israelites are the people that have been chosen by God. They are Israel's sons, otherwise known as Jacob, from the book of Genesis. So if you were with me all the way back in the book of Genesis, you have a total feel of how this is going. So I've kind of done this a little bit every day. If you have never been with me before, we are going through the Bible from cover to cover, going from the chronological order. So it's not really, just open the book and you read from start to finish, but it is in historical context, in historical order of when things happened. So at this we've already had a couple things come in, like some of the Chronicles have been in there, a couple of Psalms. I think we've read in the book of Job. And so it hasn't been completely in order, although it has been mostly in order, because this is mostly, we're just coming out of the books of the law, which Moses wrote most of. Now we are in the book of Joshua, and somebody wrote the book of Joshua, and I don't know if it was Joshua or if it was somebody after. There were maybe some scribes. I'm not 100% sure, because it doesn't seem like it's actually the writing of Joshua, only that there are some things that they know in advance that, like I said, maybe if somebody wrote afterwards, they came up and filled in some of the gaps, or maybe there was somebody at the time that was just meant to write all of these things not long after they happened, historical data wise. And speaking of, there have been a couple of comments about the historicity, about the proof of whether the Bible is true or not. And I am no expert, so I don't even want to come into that field where I think that I'm an expert. However, one of the things that I did want to point out is timing wise, and I know the New Testament, and just because of the area in which I'm speaking about the authors of some of the books of the Old Testament, the New Testament, the authors wrote these books kind of within a couple of generations of Jesus. A couple of them had been with Jesus, and a couple of them had been with people that were with Jesus. And so the writing was maybe 60, 70, 80 years after. This is sort of give and take, right? After Jesus. And the reason I want to bring this up is because somehow this got to be, and even this book of Joshua, right? If this was written either at the exact time or maybe sometime after, right after they settled in, which we see right now, they're settling into their land. Historical information isn't usually done immediately. A lot of times it's done after. And so we're in a generation where we're about 80 years after World War II. And I was just thinking of this because this new movie is coming out in regards to a woman that saved people during World War II. And we're about 80 years out of World War II. And yet there's still so many historical things that we're learning that we didn't know right away, right? Even at the time, we did not know. So these things were happening, but we didn't know, let's just say in the United States, the depths of the things that were happening. We don't even know, like now all this stuff is starting to come up and we're learning more and more about the truth of things that happen. We're learning names and dates and stories, right? And we're learning all of these things, and we consider them history, right? But we have never heard them possibly before today. So they may have been things that were written. They may be stories that have been told through some of the survivors. And so we take them for fact because these people lived it. They lived through it, or their parents lived through it, right? These are generational stories that are told over and over again. And so we mostly accept these as fact. And so to point out in some ways that because there was a time lapse that happened, that doesn't mean automatically that these things are untrue. And it's just funny, the things that we will accept as 100% truth, and then the things that we won't accept as 100% truth. So again, I want to note that this may have been Joshua that wrote everything down. It may have been written down. Somebody may have compiled all the facts of everything that happened based on stories from different people. And he compiled these facts through the Lord's blessing, right? And compiled the data and then shared it, sort of put it into a historical context to share with the Israelite people through generations, right? Because this was all stuff for us to remember this. And I say us, it wasn't even originally for us. It was originally for the Israelites, right? This was for the people to remember why they were in the land that they were in, who they needed to thank for the land that they were in, who were their historical figures that they needed to praise and deem worthy of certain things. And so this was their history, and we are just learning and relearning their history as things happened. And so just to, I don't even necessarily disprove, but just to kind of put a little monkey wrench in some of those ideals that we say it certainly can't be real if the actual person isn't speaking it to me at that time, because we don't live at that time. And so there are certain things that we need to take for fact based on so much other evidence. And this is one of those things, right? We know generationally the tribes of Israel lived in Israel. And so now we are going back and finding out how they got there. Right. And so, again, just a little tidbit for you to kind of take with you and do with it what you will. But just in the area of historical data, whether it's true or untrue, right? So we are right in the middle of learning after my brief history lesson. We're right in the middle of learning about Joshua. Joshua is allotting land to certain tribes. At this point, he has allotted land to 2.5 tribes. I was going to do a 3, but 2.5 tribes. So it was Reuben, Gad, and West Manasseh, and they are on the west side of Israel. So they are on the west side of the Dead Sea, of the Jordan. And so they're kind of occupying all these areas that are currently Jordan and possibly Syria. I think it's Syria, which is right above. And then we sort of moved into Judah is taking up that sort of that entire southern section. And then we learned about the two sons of Joseph, which are Ephraim and Manasseh. And so their area and what area that they were in. And at this point, there are 7 more tribes that need to get their land, and they haven't gotten their land yet. And so just going to start up with the beginning of this. So starting in verse 1. So we're in Joshua 18, verse 1. The whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. So at this point, if you guys have been with me from the beginning, you understand what the tent of meeting is. If you have not, or just to remind you, the tent of meeting is the place where God dwelled with his people. So he came down and he spoke directly to his people in the tent of meeting, in the tabernacle. So the tabernacle was this huge, what we could now look at as a synagogue or a church, right? It was this huge area for people to come in. And they assembled there, right? And then inside there was this tiny little area in which the high priest would go in, make some of the offerings, and he would speak to God there, and God would speak to him there. And that was a precious place that very few people could go in at this point. Only the high priests could go in there, and nobody else. And so right now the high priest is Eleazar, and he is the one that is able to go into the tent of meeting where the Ark of the Covenant is and where the 10 commandments are. And obviously where God dwells. I think Aaron's staff was in there as well. So there were a couple of things in there. The book of the law was in there as well. And so these were special places, and they set this up in Shiloh. And so in Israel, this was on the West Bank. This is the east of the Dead Sea. And so it's kind of like smack in the middle of the area. It's in the land of Ephraim. So I had to look at my notes a little bit for this because I didn't remember all the details. But it's right in the land of Ephraim, which is kind of right in the middle of Israel, sort of like a long. And it's right in the middle of there. And so that's where Shiloh is, and that's where the tent of meeting is. And one of the reasons I assume that this is put in there is because, remember, for all those festivals, everyone had to come and congregate there. So the fact that it would be in the middle would make the most amount of sense, because everyone from every end would have the easiest amount of traveling in order to get to this location, because they had to come and celebrate all together as a people multiple times a year. So not just once a year, multiple times a year. So, okay. So we're in verse 2. That was all of that for verse 1. So in verse 2, it says, the country was brought under their control, but there were still 7 Israelite tribes who had not yet received their inheritance. And then Joshua said to them, how long are you going to wait before you begin to find it? So I love this about Joshua. So back a few chapters ago, God was very clear that Joshua and Eleazar and the elders were going to split the area up by lot. And yet, here we go. We come into this land, and certain land was promised, right? Caleb was like, hey, this is the area for me. Manasseh and Ephraim were promised certain areas. And so they moved into their areas. And so they're kind of all set. And of course, obviously, the other 2.5 tribes on the other side. And now here we are with these 7 tribes that haven't picked out their area yet. And Joshua is like, well, what have you been doing? Why aren't you picking out your area? So again, this delicate balance of how Joshua was supposed to give it to him by lot, and yet they're still supposed to do the work, right? This is this constant delicate balance that we constantly have in our faith all the time too, right? We are supposed to step out and go, and yet we're also supposed to surrender all of our decisions to the Lord, right? So I know it says somewhere, I believe it's in James, you say you're going to go here, but I say if the Lord wills it, right? So yet we're supposed to go, and we're supposed to do the things that he asks us to do. So Joshua, I feel like, is kind of giving him a hard time, like, hey, you haven't gone and looked. So he tells them to go, 3 people from each tribe are supposed to go look at all the land, everything that's left. They're supposed to survey the entire area, and they're supposed to write all these details, which is another thing that I feel is pretty cool. When we think that these people back before Jesus's time, 2,000 years BC, or probably I think that's about what this is at this point, maybe 1,000 years BC, they were writing and reading. So these were not uneducated people. They were writing, reading, making maps, forming plans, all these kind of things. So they were all to go in, and this is just regular people. This isn't the top people. This is the elders of their tribe, but they're still just regular people. And so they went into the land. They went all over because they had to go north and south and east and west. And they had to go all over, and they had to figure out all of these allotments of all these lands. And then they came back and they showed everything to Joshua. And then Joshua and Eleazar then threw lots, right, which is the Urim and Thummim. Hopefully I got them right this time. Threw those things. And then by lot, all of these lands were given to the people. So one of the things that I did want to read was verse 11. And I think this goes right to Benjamin. So before that, it's just reading verse 10. Joshua then cast lots for them in Shiloh in the presence of the Lord. And there he distributed the land to the Israelites according to their tribal divisions. So according to each brother. All right, so going into 11, it says the first lot came up for the tribe of Benjamin according to its clan. Their allotted territory lay between the tribes of Judah and Joseph. So remember that Joseph is Ephraim and Manasseh, so they kind of both got this area. And then way down south is Judah, and then the tribe of Benjamin is right in the middle. So if I read verse 9, moving on to the next chapter, sorry, in Joshua 19, actually it just says all the areas in which they live. So it gives you all the towns and everything where they live, and it just says their boundaries. Then I'm going to move on into, so they have the towns that are given to Benjamin, and one of the towns that they're given, I think is funny because it's Jericho, and Jericho is burned to the ground, left with nothing, and so they're not even supposed to rebuild Jericho. So he gets the town of Jericho, but he's not allowed to live in the town of Jericho. And then moving down to 19:1, it says the second lot came out for the tribe of Simeon according to its clans. Now their inheritance lay within the clan of Judah. So remember I said that Judah is all the way down south, kind of goes all the way down to the point down south. And then there's a little circular area where Simeon lives. And so the one thing that I actually just wanted to note in this land is that one of the verses is, I'm going to go to verse 9. So one of the verses, it says that the inheritance of the Simeonites was taken from the share of Judah because Judah's portion was more than they needed. So the Simeonites received that inheritance within the territory of Judah. And why I wanted to note it was this. So I write myself notes while I'm doing this because I'm certainly not going to memorize everything, especially a lot of these books that I'm not super completely familiar with, right? Some of them that I haven't studied for a long time. What I wrote in my notes, here's what it says. I'm going to read it again. The inheritance of the Simeonites was taken from the share of Judah because Judah's portion was more than they needed. And in my notes, I wrote Judah's portion was too much. So, and this is why it's important, because I want to say that's a negative. coming from Simeon's perspective, right? I was thinking to myself, Judah had too much. And so Simeon had to take some of that, right? And so it was this like kind of like negative thing, like they didn't need it, it was too much. But that's not really what it says. It says it's more than they needed because God gave them this land according to Lot, right? So, and according to Lot means is that God made these choices, right? They prayed for it, they spoke about it, they rolled the dice, and God made these choices. And so God gave to each what they needed. And he didn't give them more than they needed. He didn't give them less than they needed. He gave them what they needed. And this land of Judah at this point was more than they needed. It wasn't too much, like they were taking it, or like how dare they take more than Simeon, right? They didn't deserve it. So it had nothing to do with it. But in my mind, I sort of switched it over into this thing where it was like they were being greedy. And then turning it around the other way, then they were being generous by giving it up. And neither of those things are true. What it is it was more than they needed. It was area that Simeon needed. And so Simeon got that area and Judah no longer had that area. And I just in the way that my natural tendency is to go to jealousy. Like you have too much, you don't deserve. I don't have enough, I do deserve. And that's not the way God works. We should be content with what we have, and we should feel blessed for those who have more. And we should be encouraged for anyone who has less, right? So this is not about like thinking someone is less than if they have less, or that they don't deserve it if they have more, or they did deserve it if they have less. That means they didn't do something right. And I think here we go again with a matter of, for me at least, and you guys may not have thought this way, but internally in my brain, for me, just recognizing what I have is what God wants me to have. What I don't have is what God doesn't need me to have. And to be content and even joyful with what I do have. And so not expecting more, not feeling like I deserve more, not being discontent and hungry and striving for more that I shouldn't be getting. Right. And then obviously even thinking, going down that path of being willing to do things that I shouldn't be doing because I feel like I need more. So it's just a note that when I went in my brain, it was just something I wanted to talk about. All right. So we're still just giving out land. All right. So moving on a little bit from here, because some of these lands you're going to see are really tiny, but they have less people, and they might have more better areas than certain other areas, right? Certain people have mountains, certain people have wilderness, and so everybody, it's just a little bit different. And so God just gave according to the people group that He wanted to give to, how He wanted to give it. All right. So moving on, so that we just gave to Simeon. The next one that we give to in verse 10, the third lot goes to Zebulun. And so Zebulun got a tribe. And then after that, it was Issachar. And then Issachar was small. They just got 16 towns and villages. After that was Asher. Asher was the fifth lot. And he's up north. And it's funny now, he's although Asher and I think it's Naphtali, who was right after that, is up north. And they're next to each other. And they both, mostly Asher, has a big piece of what's considered now Lebanon. And so that is no longer considered in the land of Israel. And that's a little bit of Lebanon. And then they have then they have some of Syria, right? So Naphtali and Asher, they have some of Syria. And then the seventh lot goes to Dan, which is below and to the west of Ephraim. And then I want to read verse 47, which is right near the end here. So this one I thought was really interesting. So this is Dan. Dan was the seventh lot. Seventh lot came out for the tribe of Dan according to its clans. The territory of their inheritance included, and showed all these areas that included. But then in verse 47, it says, when the territory of the Danites was lost to them, they went up and attacked Leshem, took it, put it to sword, and occupied it. They settled in Leshem and named it Dan after their ancestor. And so this is one of those areas where I'm kind of thinking maybe it wasn't Joshua and it was a little bit afterwards. I don't know when these tribes of Dan, because it says when the territory of the Danites was lost to them. There was a time where it was lost with the battle of, I believe, either the Babylonians or Assyrians, which has not happened yet. It's for a long time to come. And so are they not necessarily changing, but adding to the historical documents, right? So it was in there what it was, and then they made some changes because they lost the area and they needed to change that. So I'm not necessarily sure, but I find this interesting because I don't know when we're going to find out, or if we're going to find out when and if Dan lost their territory. So just a note in there that Dan was given a certain place, they lost it, and then they took over another place and they made that their place instead. And so that was the territory of Dan. That's where we're ending today. So it was a little bit of a shorter one. So I hope you were able to stick with me. I hope you got information. If this was a blessing, I want you to like it. I want you to share it. I want you to subscribe to the channel so you can get this every day. Keep up your reading with me. And I'll see you guys next time.